it was interesting how it was the best culture when I started, and over the course of a few years, some things happened that caused it all to the culture to just kind of implode. And it was an interesting study in that.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. All right, I am here with Brian Powell. Some of you may know Brian's name. He's been around for a while. If you have an old LabVIEW CD, his name might even be on there, is it?
On
the packaging or something?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Because I know you were like one of the original LabVIEW developers, right?
Yeah, I joined NI in the late 1980s. I was part of a growth spurt when they were trying to rewrite LabVIEW. They'd made LabVIEW 1, and we called it this prototype that we shipped. And then we decided we needed to rewrite it from scratch. And so I was hired as part of a team to rewrite LabVIEW from, throw away the prototype, literally throw away the prototype and write it new.
Okay,
so,
is that why they threw it away, because it was a prototype? Is that like the reasoning?
It had so many shortcomings top to bottom that we needed to change just about everything about it. Okay. It ran out of like you could write VIs that were too big to save. It couldn't be loaded anymore because we were overrunning certain limits on things like that, but we didn't have good error checking to check for things, and so it was easy to corrupt things. They were all very slow at loading, slow at running, and so that's why we decided to introduce a compiler.
Well, it was also probably much smaller at that time, although probably relative to other programs at that time it was probably big.
Well, we had about a dozen people on the LabVIEW R&D team when I joined, and we had two rooms that were kind of a strip center kind of office, and we had the front panel room and the block diagram room, and so I was in the block diagram room and learned a lot about how the block diagram worked.
Cool. Is this the Orange Bowl day?
This was back in the days of the Orange Bowl.
Why don't you tell that story, because I don't think people know, not everybody knows that story.
So this was late 80s, and the source code control systems did exist, but we didn't really use them very much. And so our source code was kept on a Sun workstation that was a Apple Local Talk server, also predated Ethernet days. And so, but if I wanted to copy my files up to the server, it asked, do you want to overwrite what's up there? Because there was no real protection around it. It wasn't an idea of versions of things. It was just the latest version was on the server. And so, of course, we needed some sort of mutex to make sure that two people didn't copy up at the same time. And so Jeff Parker, who was one of the LabVIEW, he was in the front panel room. He had brought his lunch that day in an orange Tupperware bowl. It was about like this, it had a lid on it. And so he decided, okay, I'll wash it out, and it's going to be our mutex. And so whoever had the orange bowl on top of their monitor is the one who had permission to write the files to the file server. And then we needed a one-element queue, so we knew who had the bowl next. And so we took the lid off, and whoever had the lid had the bowl, got the bowl after you were done bowling.
And that worked fairly well, or well
enough? Worked great. The problem was you couldn't go back in time, so if somebody messed something up and then you didn't notice until a week or two later, there was no going back to it unless somebody had not pulled down from the server in a while. And so, then you get to where somebody I'm going to copy down every week into a backup folder in case we need to go back to it and do it that way. But our hard drives were small, so we didn't have a ton of disk space to spend on it. So eventually, of course, we migrated to real source code control systems.
Yeah, well, when I started, I think NI was really big on Perforce. I think it was like pre-Get.
That's right. We spent a lot of time actually investigating source code control systems and chose one that Schlumberger was managing, was saying that they were going to commercialize. Mm-hmm. And we chose it, liked it, and then they decided not to commercialize it because they're more focused on the oil and gas industry, and just didn't make sense for them. And so then the second choice was Perforce, and it served NI for many years as a central source code control system. But now everybody's moving to GitLab.
I was going to
and
say, yeah, I
GitHub.
imagine they're on Git because I see them. They have a lot of open source repositories on GitHub.
They use Azure DevOps as their Microsoft-centric tool chain right now.
Yeah. No, actually, I dislike Microsoft, but I hear decent things about that. So, yeah, decent enough. Better than Teams. I'm not a huge fan.
It's part of it.
It is like all one big suite. So after you were in R&D, what did you do for NI then after that?
So yeah, I was in R&D for 22 years in a variety of roles. And I worked on, one of the things, that I've talked about in my career is like I would try to think about after every couple of years, reevaluate what I'm doing. And do I want to change it? Do I want to keep going in my current role and my current job, or do I want to do something different? So sometimes I want to become a manager, and I became a people manager for a while. And then after, 4, 6, 7 years, I'm getting bored of this, and I'm frustrated with it. Like, I want to help.
Yeah.
I want to do some of the work that my team is working on, and so I switched back to the technical track. That's when I worked on 64-bit LabVIEW. That's when I worked on LabVIEW robotics. And so that was a lot of fun. And then created the field architect program. That was like the one thing that pulled me out of R&D, was to go and make, in a more customer-facing role, invent it from scratch. Of build up customer proficiency was the theory, is if you made the NI customers better at programming LabVIEW, that they would buy more product. And we proved that. And our handful of accounts, or 3 of us, we had about $55 million in accounts, and we grew that to like $68 million, and it was 21% revenue growth while the rest of NI was growing 3%. And it's like, I thought it was a great thing, and I just couldn't convince NI to continue investing in that. And so that's actually one of the things that led me to leave NI, is I was so frustrated that I had a good idea but really couldn't pursue it. And so that's when I left NI and went into healthcare for a few years and started doing work at Athena Health.
Cool. I want to go back to something you said previously, though. You said you moved from engineering into management. What drove that? What did you think you were going to get into by moving into management, and what did you end up with? Yeah,
that's a good question. So that was very much in an era of the career path was you became a manager, right? There wasn't this idea of a split career path of the technical track and the management track. One of the things I helped with was develop this parallel track. As a manager, I helped develop this parallel track, and how do you grow as a technical lead without managing people? Because we had some really good people who were never going to be good people managers, and so how do you make it so that they don't languish as just a software engineer with no means of promotion unless they want to start managing a team?
Yeah, I feel like that's still an issue. I feel like some places have figured that out, but a lot still haven't.
That's right. And I think that's, I loved being a manager. I loved the team that I managed. I had a great set of people, and they were kind of mostly senior engineers. But, the role became less technical over time, too. Initially I was a technical manager involved in technical discussions and details, but eventually that role grew into, you're more, I always complain, I felt like I was doing report cards all the time. And it's like, no, I want to go help again. And so that's what made me switch back.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I'm curious, because I find you run your own business now and I run my own business. I find that I move away from the technical stuff a little bit. Like, I still have time to do it, but I feel like there's a lot of other skills that I'm getting pulled into. Do you feel that, or?
Yes. Though when I started my consulting company, I thought it was actually going to be more how to be a good fractional VP of engineering, fractional CTO, more on that kind of business side. I did a culture workshop. I thought it was going to be more about team building. How do I put together a strong engineering team? Because that's what I'd done for the last 6 years at Athena Health and then the startup at the Zebra. And I thought I was going to continue that. But then the work, because I was also putting myself out there in the LabVIEW community and talking to NI customers, naturally it sort of gravitate towards, like, we have some LabVIEW work that needs to be done. Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
And it's like, yes, I do. And it was sort of a way to get back into it, into the LabVIEW world. And I really love that aspect of it too. I mean, I love the part about helping people build strong software teams because I feel like I'm good at that. But I also think I'm pretty good at writing LabVIEW code and understanding, big software architectures, and working on, some of my projects are like rewrite this 20-year-old LabVIEW DAC system, and I enjoy the kind of legacy code kind of stuff. I really, that's something I enjoy more than the sort of blue ocean start from scratch kind of stuff.
I enjoy both, but it's a different challenge. There is a challenge to getting inside somebody else's head and looking at the code and figuring out, like, why did they do it this way? Like, what were they thinking? Like, it's easy to look at what they did. The hard part is figuring out why and what the intention was.
That's right. But, the code archaeology part of, I have to understand how did this work?
Yeah. Well, there's also an interesting side to that in that regardless of their intentions, the system does something. And whatever it does, there are people relying on it doing what it does. And so at some point, like the issue of whether it's correct or not almost goes out the window in a sense, or it can, depending on what you're doing.
Right. One of the projects that I worked on, which is one where almost everything went wrong that could go wrong with it, and I started it right before the pandemic began, and as part of my original quote of work to do was to go visit the actual machine, hook up some logic analyzers to really understand the timing of it was a timing based system, and I didn't trust the documentation to be 100% accurate. And then the pandemic happened and they basically didn't allow travel to their site, and so all I had to go on was the documentation, which turned out to be right. But I didn't really know it until I delivered the system several months later, and they're hooking it up to logic analyzers to make sure it behaves the way that the old system did.
I had a similar issue with the system where it was timing based and it was like mixing soil samples with a bunch of chemicals and stuff. And I had the technician, the mechanical engineer, and the manager all standing there. And I was like, okay, what does the machine do? Oh, well, it turns this on for 10 seconds. And every single one of them had a different description of what it did. Yes. And I'm looking at the code, and I know what I think it does based on the code. And none of us were right. We sat there with the stopwatch, and we timed it, and we're like, oh, wait.
Yeah. In my case, it was a 20-year-old system, but the documentation had been written in the last year by a guy who was about to retire. And so he's writing it from his memory. Recollection of how it behaved. Yeah. And this was also, last year at GDevCon, I talked about refactor versus rewrite. This was one of those cases where I went into it thinking that I should refactor because I didn't fully understand the system. And in retrospect, I should have really understood the timing aspect of the system, not the code, and then built a system that satisfied the timing requirements. And it should have been a rewrite. But
well, that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I've landed more on the refactor side lately. But the interesting thing is often the original requirements don't matter, and it's just like what it does now. But I think Steve told me a story where he ran into one where it was passing almost all the parts, and he rewrote it, and it was passing like 40% of the parts, and they're like, no, it must be wrong. And he went and proved that his system was right and that they should have been rejecting all those all along. So in that case, the actual behavior was really wrong.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. And another thing about that project is when I delivered it to the guy who operated the system, and he had a different understanding. Actually, had a clearer understanding of how the system should behave and how it was designed to behave that way that was forgotten by the original designers. There was a multiple redundant system, and there was supposed to be one always should win if everything works correctly. So you get this repeatability of one was skewed a little early and the others were skewed a little late, and the one that's skewed a little early is the trigger that should always win, but you have a backup here. And I didn't know why are we rounding down here and we're rounding up here, until I talked to the operator of no, we want to make sure that this one always wins. And it's that was not in the documentation. Right? It was just a subtlety of, it's in the code of just a rounding thing, and then you find an operator who does it every day. Now it makes sense.
Well, that's one of those things where, the clean code guys are always like, oh, comments are code smells and all this stuff. And I do agree, if you're commenting every line, your comment is set A equal to 5, well, okay, that's a code smell. But in that case, it seems like a comment is needed because the operation is very clear, but the reason for the operation is not clear at all.
Yeah. Documenting the intent.
Yeah.
Yep. Nobody documented that intent.
Yeah. Well, that brings up another question that, like, where do you document that stuff? In that case, like, a comment in the code makes a lot of sense, but, like, sometimes, like, it's not, like, one thing. It's a series of things that happen, and, like, do you do, like, the wiki thing where you have, like, a separate wiki or something? I've always been a fan of, like, comments in the code or with the code, or...
Yeah, I think it gets lost, or it has stands a good chance of getting lost if it's not right there with the code. You know, in this case, you know, if they documented in this 42-page document that was written 20 years later, that would have been a good place too, because I was studying that 42 pages, like looking at the document, looking at the code, going back and forth. But I am also a big believer in document it somewhere. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, better than nothing. Yeah. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about documentation. I'm really a big fan of anti-doc and auto-generating documentation because that's much less likely to lie. Like, comments are often, like, aspirational. Like, I wanted to do this, but does it do it? Who knows, right?
Yes. Well, like, when I build, like, web backends, I will start with the, what is it called, Open API. I forget what it used to be called. It was called something else. And it forces you to say, what are the like, RESTful commands that you are sending to the web backend, and what are all the possible responses, what's the format of those responses, and I actually will start there before I write any of the backend. I'm going to just say, what are the commands I'm going to receive, and what's the format going to be? Can it return a 200 error, a 400 error, you know, some other kind of error? And that forces me to think about, it's the kind of it's the documentation for my RESTful API, but it is also then teaching me, now I need to make sure I have cases for all of these things when I write the code.
Do you write the tests first then in that case, or no?
Sometimes, because then in that case I would use something like Postman as the thing to send a web, you know, RESTful web command and look at the response and see, is the response what I expected? And that also can help me understand, is my database is database matching what I'm seeing in the response? And so as I go along, I'm using my original documentation of the API. I'm using Postman to ingest that and start to come up with, you know, simple queries that I can make to my backend.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing that type of thing, and then, like, it's starting with the end in mind, right? It's starting with, like, what you want to end up with, and if you big fan of writing unit tests for that, and then the unit tests kind of act as a documentation in a way.
Yes, but, you know, that's one example. I also sometimes do it without, you know, I'm not one of these, like, I always have to do it the same way every single time. It depends on the situation.
Yeah, I like writing unit tests, and I talk about them a lot, and people are like, oh, you must always write unit tests, and I hate to say that I don't all the time, so there are exceptions, so. I don't want to come off as too dogmatic.
There was one time that I wrote unit tests. I was building some sort of web. I wrote a blog post about how writing your own web server in LabVIEW. And I was trying to interact with, I have these little wireless temperature sensors, and so writing to their web service. And so I was needing to use SSL for some of the communications. And I wrote unit tests on top of, this was right around the time, I forget what version of LabVIEW it was, where they hadn't introduced some of their, like, secure hash functions yet. And so the recommended way was to call a .NET API that implemented these things. It was relatively straightforward to write a LabVIEW wrapper around it. But then NI came out with a LabVIEW implementation of it. And for whatever reason, I think I wrote some unit tests for the .NET stuff just to make sure that I understood it. And I thought, you know, normally I would not write a unit test for this, you know, well-known algorithm for how you do secure hashes. But, you know, I did it for myself, not just to prove that Microsoft knew what they were doing. And I kept them in my project. And then when the new version of LabVIEW came out, I moved my code up to that version and substituted in the NI functions. The API was a little bit different in how it worked, so I had to, you know, write a little wrapper around it. And I said, well, let's run my unit tests. And I ran them, and they all passed except for one. And then that turned out to be a LabVIEW bug. And so I actually reached out to a friend of mine who is in LabVIEW R&D, who was responsible, or he read my blog post that said, you know, avoid this function. And he actually commented about, okay, I found the bug. You can go open up vi.lib and go to this case and change this 55 to a 56. And then that solved the problem. And I'll fix it in the next version of LabVIEW. And I was really glad that I'd written that unit test, even though that's not normally something I would write a unit test for. But I was glad that I had it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is some talk at software engineering circles of writing unit tests for some of your dependencies. So then if they change, if the version upgrades or something, you can catch bugs like that. Yeah.
And I think that's probably what motivated me is like I was moving from .NET and one implementation to another. And so maybe I'll try some unit tests just to make sure I really understand how it works.
That's where I really like the idea of approval testing. I don't know if you've seen this, but like basically you run the code, you capture the output. It's like a golden template or something. So you don't necessarily care what it is. You just care that it doesn't change, right? Because you're assuming that the LabVIEW implementation is correct. And then when you move to the new or the .NET implementation is correct, then when you move to the new one,
right,
it should match.
And that's how the NI unit test tools typically work, is they have expected answers to expected inputs.
Yeah. You run the VI and it copies it into the thing, like the unit test framework thing. I haven't actually used that other than the NI training course a long time ago, and yeah.
But it's its philosophy, which is if that's what you need, that's great.
Yeah, there's a time and a place for that.
Did you know that the LabVIEW Experiment has a Patreon? All memberships include access to a private Discord server where you'll be able to chat with other fans. Benefits to membership include behind-the-scenes content and sneak peeks at new episodes, as well as opportunities to chat and even code with Sam. To learn more, check out our website, www.thelabviewexperiment.com. It's your contributions that keep our experiment going. Thanks.
Okay, so you moved on from NI and you went to Athena Health. You want to talk about that a little bit and some of your experiences there?
Yeah, I had several friends who were at Athena Health. Athena Health is a Boston-based company, but they had a small Austin office. And over the course of time, I think we probably had like 20 people move from NI to Athena Health over the time. So I had a friend who had already worked there, and I actually had several friends, but I had one in particular I reached out to, and they were doing hiring and have hiring bonuses, and so he certainly got me in for an interview. Mm-hmm. And it was another leap of faith of 26 years at NI, what's life like on the outside? And I was actually hired as a lead developer because they didn't have a manager track. So we created one while I was there, so yet another experience at that. And so I started by doing, they hired me knowing that they wanted to turn me into a manager, but I still needed to pay a little bit of dues as being a developer. Yeah. And so they had a Perl code base and not the best coding language, but it was still interesting stuff. I learned a lot about database. But one of the things was I learned a lot about culture. NI has a great culture when I worked there. But Athena Health had an even better culture. It was, and they really studied the culture. I learned a lot about how they think about culture. And we had, for example, part of the engineering organization was what was called the Ministry of Fun. Oh. And so we had, in Boston, we had I called her the Prime Minister of Fun. In Austin, we had the Minister of Fun. And she was both an executive assistant to the head of the Austin office, but she also just made sure that the team was doing okay. Sometimes it was just kind of checking in with people. Sometimes it was creating fun outings for, like a summer boat party on the lake. She was there to, help the organization run well. And that was an interesting facet that I really enjoyed. Eventually, over time, that stuff disappeared just because kind of it was interesting how it was the best culture when I started, and over the course of a few years, some things happened that caused it all to the culture to just kind of implode. And it was an interesting study in that. And it also made me think that much more about how important culture was.
Do you think, so there's a saying something about like trust takes a long time to build and you lose it really quickly. Is it like related to that? Like you can build culture over time, but then as soon as you like violate some rules, like it just immediately goes away? Is that?
Yeah, there's some amount of it. I mean, some of it was the company had a bad quarter, and then an activist investor took over and then it decapitated the leadership. That's one aspect. They also hired a new CTO that completely changed the culture, and he didn't have the history with the company, and so he didn't understand how a lot of things worked. He just wanted it to work this new way. He had a great vision of how things should work. I don't think he had a very good understanding of how to get there in 1,000-member, 1,000 engineer organization. So it's what led to some layoffs and leading to loss of culture. And I say Athena Health did. I say they flew it into the ground but bounced off, and it's actually a much better company to work for now. But it was interesting to see it.
So when you talk
like
about
that.
not knowing how to get there, did you just try to take too big a step? Is that part of the problem? Because I feel like change, especially big change like that, you can't just come in and immediately change everything because people tend to resist, right? But you have to take those little steps and move in the right direction.
Yeah, so not only did the activist investor decapitate the executive leadership, the CTO decapitated the engineering leadership. And so some people who had been there since nearly the beginning, it's like 15-year-old company, not welcome here anymore because we don't need the old way. We're going to do it the new way. But you're still running a billion-dollar organization out of the old code. And he, wanted to build a new microservice-based architecture, which, great. Yes, we were bought into writing a new microservice-based architecture on top of Java. It's just that he did, I think, bite off more than he could chew. He took 35 Scrum teams and devoted them to this new thing, hired a bunch of his new architects to come lead that. But in the course of a couple of years, they didn't have a shipping product.
Oh. So would you say there's a connection between code and culture? Because you said they came in and they tried to change the culture, but they were working out the existing code base.
Well, all the new people were working on the new code base from scratch. So I think it was part of they were trying to rewrite from scratch on this very, very large monolithic application that, 11 million lines of Perl code, what we believe is the largest Perl application in the world. And you could take a smaller byte and rewrite a smaller part and ship it.
That would be my approach, yeah. Find something in the monolith that is the meatballs in the spaghetti, to use Fabiola's analogy, right? Find that meatball, pull that out, put it in its own microservice, make everything else talk to it, and then grab another one. And
They tried to do that, but they still took too big a bite.
Okay. Yeah, I listened to this guy, G. Paul Hill. I don't know if you've seen it. And he talks about change management. He calls it change harvesting, I think is what he calls it. But he's all about taking really, really small steps.
That's right. And I think that would have been, as an engineering team, we were very excited about the CTO's vision, and we all wanted to help, but we were just, there's a lot of micromanagement that went on. There's a lot of things that could have been done better that I think would have been more successful and certainly would have made us culturally more happy along the way.
Yeah, I think micromanagement can kill culture. I mean, I don't know, maybe it just creates its own different culture that nobody really likes.
Yeah, as an example, we were told we had to have Scrum teams of 3 or 5 developers.
No 4.
No 4, no 2, no 6.
Is it just an odd number? Is that the...
I guess.
Okay.
I don't have a good answer. I could not defend that to my teams who were all upset about it.
Well, I know, we right now on the GDevCon board we have 6 people, but we really want an odd number so there are no ties.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Which kind of makes sense, right? When you're making decisions, if there's a possibility of a tie, that's not good.
Yes.
Yeah, you got.
But if you've got 4 people on your team, it's you got to get rid of one or hire somebody.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that seems weird. Question I would have with that is, what is the goal, right? Any decision that you make, you're trying to achieve something. What is that?
Well, and that was part of our agile transformation. We were sort of agile before, and then he brought in some well-paid consultants to get the entire organization using agile, and so you learned, the formal agile approach, and so I think it was just part of that. Is that the rules are you should have 3 or 5 3 to 5 developers, and he interpreted it as 3 or 5.
Yeah, I know. The word agile transformation is an interesting word. When I hear that, I kind of cringe, but part of me understands it in a way in that it is really about transforming the way you think. But I feel like agile transformation means I'm coming in from the outside. I'm going to beat you over the head, and I'm going to force you to change and adapt this new thing. And
fortunately, we had a really good agile coach in Austin who really pushed home you get to decide how your team operates. He wasn't necessarily saying what corporate was saying, but he was very much, the agile philosophy of, even in our agile transformation meetings where we're just learning about agile for the first time, He let us decide when we would take breaks, and he let us decide how we would organize our day. And he was teaching you by just everything he did about, you get to decide with Agile, and only do it if it makes sense with your team for how your team wants to operate.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of the reason why a lot of Agile transformations fail, because I feel like a lot of managers don't like that.
Yeah, there's rules. You follow these rules.
Yes, you must do these things. And I kind of reminded of, I was reading, what are the books, like the Harrison Ford movies in the early 90s? Jack Ryan, right? And I read something somewhere where it was like he was a rule breaker. He's like, he understood rules were important, but he understood that the reasons for the rules were more important. And so you could break the rules if you had a good reason, of thing. So it's like, not letting the rules become more important than the reason they exist.
Yeah, one of the presentations that my boss on the LabVIEW R&D team, when I first started, he had worked in his summer job in wastewater treatment. Or actually, it may have been, his first job. And not as a manager. And, he actually, when he came to NI and worked on the LabVIEW R&D team, he created a presentation that compared the NI culture to the wastewater treatment process. And, one of the things was, why are the rules in place? And he talked about, well, at the wastewater treatment plant, we had this no smoking sign next to, where there's all this, flammable
explosive
gases that are coming out of the treatment process. And, somebody came out for a smoke, and he was standing relatively close to it. And it's, there's no smoking here. So, no, that's over there where the sign is. It's like, he didn't understand why the no smoking sign was there. It's because you're in an environment where there's flammable things. Yeah. And he didn't understand the why. He just understood that there's a sign over there that says no smoking.
Yeah, that's very different from the don't smoke by the door so people don't have to walk through it rationale.
Yes, this is so the place doesn't explode.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Yeah, I hate arbitrary rules, and I hate stuff to push down from the top, which is why I think a lot of Agile transformations fail, because they tend to be pushed down from the top. You all will attend Scrum training. You all will create Scrum teams. You all will follow SAFe or whatever it is. And
Well, with the NI culture, one of the things that I say was good about it is that it wasn't pushed down from Dr. T. Mm-hmm. It was something we all owned. We all cared about the culture. If we didn't like something, it was something that we had to resolve, and we had to discuss and change the culture, change behavior, whatever it was, and we had to protect that culture too. Mm-hmm. And so that involves how we code. We always did code reviews of all the code that went into the LabVIEW source code control. Even with the bowl, all the code had to be reviewed. That was a cultural aspect that we enforced ourselves. We decided was important, and so that was just part of our culture and a natural thing, and nobody really challenged it because they saw the reason behind it.
Yeah, and then over time, though, that culture probably evolved, right? Because now with the Get and everything, maybe the way they do that code review has changed, right?
That's right. But the reason for it of, helping, part of it was the, helping younger developers learn how the code base works and having senior developers review code and vice versa. That's a piece of it, but also just ensuring the quality of the code and ensuring that there's a process that's followed. Those are all still the reasons, even if the mechanisms all change. And, that wasn't pushed down from Jeff and wasn't pushed down from Dr. T. They all cared about the culture too, but they weren't going to mandate from on high what the NI culture was going to be.
Yeah, I think sometimes we focus too much on the what and not enough on the why.
That's
in
right.
general. Yeah,
that's right. And at Athena Health, where we also had a strong culture, we about every 6 months would, as a team, evaluate our culture and make sure that we're aligned on it. That's where we were talking yesterday about these culture workshops I learned, and it's kind of based on the same professor's work at MIT that Athena Health used from Dr. Edgar Schein, where you have your espoused values of what you say your culture is. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. You have your cultural artifacts. That is how your culture manifests itself to the world.
Yeah, that's like what I see if I walk in your office, like the things I notice. Yeah.
That's right. So I could say we do code reviews with all the code. Do I actually follow through? That's the cultural artifact.
Yeah.
And do I actually see that, I've got two people sitting there, one is describing the code to the other? Do I actually see that in action? That's a cultural artifact. At the company I worked at called the Zebra, we had as a cultural artifact, zebra pillows and zebra posters on the wall just to celebrate, zebra stuff, right? One of the other things that the Zebra had as a espoused value was express gratitude.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we activated that or showed it was we had an executive, senior leader meeting once a week. Mm-hmm. And the first thing, we went around the room and everybody said something that they were grateful for that week. And it might be something happened good at work. It might be something, somebody's kid did something good. Maybe I'm grateful to be going on vacation next week. It could be anything. Yeah. But we're taking the time to express gratitude. And so that's an example of a cultural artifact. Then, there's a third pillar of that. So we have espoused values and cultural artifacts. The third piece that's the magic is the underlying assumptions that are underlying what you say your culture is. So, for example, the Zebra had a espoused value of be scrappy. And my problem with that is different people could interpret be scrappy in different ways. It could be, I'm supposed to go fast and cut corners because, I need to get it out as fast as possible. Be scrappy and deliver quickly. And somebody else no, you don't sacrifice quality. You just need to be resourceful and do things efficiently and cleverly and things like that. And that's a very different underlying assumption to the same cultural, espoused value. But two people would behave entirely differently thinking that they are following the culture.
Okay, so let me try to apply this to my business to SAS workshops, okay? So one of our our source commitments, core values, is community, right? So the artifacts would be doing the podcast, doing GDevCon NA, right? And the intent behind that, the last part that you were talking about, could be, right? So you could interpret community as, I'm going to build my own community over here of SAS developers who do things the SAS way. Or you can interpret that as, I'm building the LabVIEW, the greater LabVIEW community, right? And those would be two, right? And it would result in two different artifacts, right?
That's right. That's right. And you might choose to invest differently depending on which one of those you're following.
Yeah.
Right? Am I going to do something that is going to ensure something good for SAS? Or am I willing to sacrifice that because I am going to focus on something that's better for the LabVIEW community as a whole?
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that framework. That's really interesting.
So, I told you I'm also on the board of 3 different nonprofits in Austin, and one of them is Austin Opera, because I'm an opera fan and I love that organization. Also the Performing Arts Center, the Long Center for the Performing Arts in Austin, and two big arts organizations in Austin. So for the opera, I ran a culture workshop to understand what our board culture was. We have about 40 people on our board. And over the summer, I had several meetings with lots of Post-it notes where we talked about what are our espoused values, what are our cultural artifacts, what are our underlying assumptions. And it was very interesting, got great engagement from the board. Even some, kind of curmudgeonly people on the board I thought wouldn't engage, and they loved it. And from that, I started to come up with, what are some of the whys behind some of the things we do. So we talked about, another example of where misalignment can be a problem is so why do we care about diversity programs? Why is that important to us? If you think it's because I'm going to sell more tickets, then you're going to invest one way. If you're thinking it's going to build a stronger organization, you're going to invest a different way. And so let's get alignment on those underlying assumptions. And so from that exercise, we wrote down a set of guiding principles of we believe in investing in our local community. And then we talked about some of the aspects of that. We have a local orchestra, and we have a contract with the orchestra union in Austin. We hire local singers when we can. We do performances outside the main concert hall and elsewhere in the community to reach out. Another one of our guiding principles was investing in staff. And we talked about why it's important to invest in staff and some of the aspects of that.
Is it just to prevent turnover? Is it to build them up? Is it to,
That's right. That's right. So And then, you know, seeing that written down, and then you can always go back to that with the board of saying, you know, like, you know, remember, these are why we're doing some of these things, and make sure we also balance it. So like, there's another aspect was innovation. Why are we doing this innovation? Because we decided it was important for us.
Yeah. Well, I think the artifacts are always indicative of the underlying assumptions. So, like, there's always that connection, right? Whether you're intentional about it or not. And I think it's almost like going backwards and looking at the artifacts. Like, if you don't understand why, if you look at the artifacts, the why becomes clearer, I think.
That's exactly right, and that's why I love running that culture workshop and doing all the Post-it notes, because that.
Do people have this like aha moment? Like, we're talking about this, and some people are like, wait, I thought I meant this, and aha, that's why this is happening.
That was kind of my role as the facilitator with all this. I'm taking these Post-it notes and trying to match them up, and like, this doesn't quite match up. Let's talk about this a little bit more.
It's almost like that reckoning, that like self-discovery thing where you're like, I've been lying to myself all this time. I thought this, and now all of a sudden I realize, like, holy crap, I believe this other thing.
Okay. That also means that there might be people who have different underlying assumptions that won't reconcile with the organization. And then it's like you have to decide. It's like, well, if you don't want to invest in innovation, you know, like we're producing some, you know, 21st century operas, and if you really want to stay with, you know, 19th century and 18th century opera, this may not be the best opera company for you to be on the board and really support, because you wouldn't be supporting at least half of what we do.
Well, that's interesting. So we often think of change as adding things and an additive process, like we're trying to improve, so we're adding things, but sometimes the biggest change comes when you remove stuff.
That's right.
Right? And so sometimes removing people who are not in alignment is almost, actually I'd say it is a bigger change and a bigger positive impact than adding another person who's a believer.
That's right, and that's one of the things that I've done as the chair of the trustees committee of the opera is to make sure that we have the right board for us. And so yes, sometimes that means addition and sometimes that means subtraction.
Yeah, well, that's very much on my mind as like a small business owner, because I very much want to grow my business and hire people, but like when you're a one-man band and you hire somebody, right there is 50% of your culture.
That's right.
So it's like a big investment. It's a big chance. It's like,
Is this the right thing? One of the things I always talked about with interviewing somebody is that, you know, because especially at NI and at Athena Health and at the Zebra, a lot of my time was focused on hiring people and interviewing people. And one of the rules that we had, I think I learned this from NI, was like, you can say yes to a candidate, but only if you're willing to sit next to them for the next 6 months. Like, I can't say yes for some other team. Okay? You're talking about your team and whether you're willing to sit next to this person and mentor them, whatever it is they need for the next 6 months. And if you're not willing to say yes to that, then you're a no for hiring this person.
I was listening to Noah's podcast, and it was he was talking about this is either hell yes or hell no. Yeah. Right? Like, either you're 100% for it and it's like a great fit, and it's an amazing fit, and if it's not, then the answer has to be no.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's an interesting way to look at things.
Yeah. At Athena Health, we had a -3 to +3 rating with no zero. Like, you couldn't be on the fence. You had to be somewhere. And +3 was essentially, if you don't hire this person, I will quit.
Yeah.
And then -3 is, if you hire this person, I will quit.
Yeah.
And then, you know, so mostly you have 1s and 2s. But if you don't have somebody who's willing to be a 3, then you say no to the person.
Well, that's an old consultant's trick, because I've been with a bunch of consultants. It's like nothing's allowed in the middle, and like maybe only one on either end, and like everything else you have to try to create things, because otherwise people like make everything one extreme or the other, or like dead center, and people aren't willing to take a chance and
You had to choose.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's been a great discussion. I'm really enjoying this. I could probably go on forever, but I feel like we're coming up on time, so we should probably wrap things up.
Well,
do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Sam, first of all, for having me here as part of the LabVIEW experiment. I think that's awesome that you do that, and I enjoy listening to them. Thank you, of course, also for all the work you put into GDevCon North America. Thank you for doing that, and all you do for the LabVIEW community. So thank you for all that. You know, I've had a great time. I've enjoyed having some of your scotch. I really appreciate that. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I should thank you, because you and Steve at your Oregon Fab were nice enough to invite me to come to your DSH workshop and present with you guys. And I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot.
We did too.
You guys challenged me a lot, which is okay. Fab challenged me more than not, although I was very happy that at one point she did stick up for me a little bit. Yeah. Or at least gave me a chance to rephrase my statement.
Fab challenges all of us, and we love it.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that. So she is that personality, but that's okay. We still love her. Yeah. Cool. Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.
That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment.